Namibia and the Namibian Business Angels Network. And he's going to be bringing a perspective on angel investing and early stage finance. Thank you so much, Jesaya, for joining us on this panel today. And we also have with us Jean-Luc. I'm so sorry. I actually practiced this all night. Agboyibo, who is the CEO of Omega Sports Holding and the founder of Melodo and a member of the SESLA Expert Working Group, bringing expertise in sports investment, grassroots development, and youth economic participation. And we also have Tomiwa Aladekomo, who is the CEO of Big Cabal Media. If you know about TechCabal, which is the leading tech media publication in Africa, a thought leader on digital media innovation and Africa's creative economy. So welcome, gentlemen. And please, we'll just start with Jesaya, Jean-Luc, and Tomiwa, if you would just also give some more context into what you do for the audience here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, my name is Jesaya Hano-Oshike. So I am a director of the TechCabal Fund of Namibia, where we basically try to crowd in basically funding through non-profit kind of means, this early stage investor and the startup ecosystem. Given that much of the capital that is in Namibia is really more less we would call risk averse, I should guess. So we just, but I'm also involved in many other initiatives, including the Namibia Business Angel Network. I help found that as well. I also run a VC firm called the Geriatric Investment Managers. So we basically invest commercially into startups. So one of the areas that's really emerging, even our government in Namibia is trying to kind of push, is create the creative economy. And so we're really trying to look into how best to we finance it through the various platforms that I'm part of. Thank you very much, and looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Jesaya. Jean-Luc, please go ahead and just do a quick intro.
Yeah, please. I don't know if it's my audio, but I was struggling to hear Jesaya. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can
Yes,
hear.
I can hear you.
It's actually much
Thank you.
better this time as well because there was a bit of background in the first intro. So well done.
Okay, so just to pronounce correctly my name, I'm Jean-Luc Agboyibo. I'm from Togo. I'm the CEO of Omega Sport Holding. It's an investment company. We invest in clubs, sports apparel, media. I started that 2 years ago. Prior to that, I worked for the NBA Africa on the Basketball Africa League initiative, and before the NBA, I launched a non-profit Milidu, which means we're together in Eve. My Togolese by language. It was a grassroots initiative to use the game of basketball as an educational tool in Togo and in Ivory Coast.
Thank you so much, Jean-Luc. And then Tomiwa.
Good evening, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Tomiwa Aladekomo. I'm CEO of Big Cabal Media, which is a company that publishes TechCabal, which is the largest Pan-African tech publication. We have reporters out of Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and we try to cover the length and breadth of African tech, the business and the impact of technology in Africa. We also have a unit called TechCabal Insights, which provides data, insights, and analysis across Africa's digital economy. And we say that we like to work with anyone who is invested in Africa's prosperity. And so we will do work that stretches beyond the digital economy if we think that it serves Africa. We have a small publication, it's not so small publication called Zikoko, which is very Nigeria focused, but TechCabal is the one that you might have heard of. It's great to be here today. And I think Zikoko actually is relevant to today's conversation because along with creating youth content, recently we had our first foray into film, creating 3 short films. And so we have quite a fondness for It is also the focus of TechCabal's annual conference, Moonshot. The creative economy is always a really popular sort of sector in there. So excited about this conversation. I'm looking forward to have it. And apologies that I don't have the right background because I too am struggling with Zoom. But yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tomiwa. And interestingly, one of my clients worked on one of your short films. And I remember being surprised when the film came because obviously I advised her on coming on that production. And I was like, oh, when did Zikoko start making films? So that was really interesting. So I'll stick with you, Tomiwa. Just in terms of how the flow of the conversation, from your perspective, how is Africa's cultural and creative economy changing the way the world sees the continent? Um, and what gaps in the funding models make it harder for creative entrepreneurs to scale? I mean, you are in the media world. You started out with TechCabal, and now we have Zikoko, which I think Zikoko has ended up stepping in the place of Combini, if you remember during the days of Combini, kind of. Yes. I did some work with Combini at the time, and it was quite sad when they left the market. I'm happy to see Zikoko, which is 100% locally owned. That was a French company, and this is a locally owned company doing this kind of media. So what has sort of how do you see the narrative changing? And I think where you sit between tech and the creative economy is interesting because those dynamics play out in both spaces. And what are the funding gaps? So in you as a media company setting up and scaling, I think speaking to your experience as well would also help in putting some fence around this conversation for investors. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay. So what's changing? I think that our music, our movie industries have done a fantastic job on putting a different face to Africa. So once upon a time, narratives about the continent were entirely defined by the West. Um, and I think that having our own music, our own movies, our own stars allows us to control the conversation. A star, etc. We are able to show that we are more than whatever it is that we're portrayed on. We are able to show people with agency, with creativity. I think you're seeing that across the creative economy, our movies, Nigeria being a particular star in here, but even across the continent, independent films, other film industries sort of becoming global, our art scene in terms of visual arts. All of that allows us to sort of project power. And if you think about America, America has built itself into a global power on the power of its media, its culture being exported. And so I think it's really critical that as a continent that we have built this, even in our writing, our writers have sort of staked a claim in terms of the way the world thinks about the continent. And so I think the more we strengthen that, the more that we define our own narratives, the more imaginative those narratives are, the more of a stake we have in the world that we live in, the more we can control it. I think that extending from just the cultural aspect, you need strong media companies from the continent because it's not enough just to create the content. You want to be able to make money for it. You want to have distribution and global reach and distribution um, because great content that only sits on other people's platforms essentially sits at the mercies of those platforms. And so you look at Netflix pulling out or Amazon Prime pulling out and the impact it's had on the film industries. And that impact is still being felt and still being digested, but eventually it will lead to a reduction in the scope of our reach and our ability to create movies and to create content that reaches global platforms. When we talk about music, one of the big areas of concern is that the global majors control the libraries of so many musicians on the continent. As we're building big stars, you have some of them selling their entire sort of like books to global platforms. And it means that ultimately control of those platforms will not be, or controls of those entire bibliographies will not sit with Africans. They will sit with global platforms to do what they wish with. So we have to build great media businesses from the continent. What's the difficulty in that? Advertising tends to be the biggest funding for most media businesses. Advertising is essentially driven by the power of the consumer. Our consumers have less power than the West and the East. And so we have a lot less advertising available to power our media companies. Um, Additionally, very many of our media companies aren't structured for success. They aren't keeping great enough records. They aren't organized from an ownership and cap table perspective in ways that allow investors to come in. Um, and so you'll see in the case of, a company like Maven, with big, but even when Maven took in capital, it required extensive reworking and reorganization of their books and their business by the investors. Um, So for a lot of media companies, ambitious, creating great company run by talented and capable people, there will be a ton of work in order to take in capital to grow to the level of ambition that they want. But I think really much more important is the fact that we're constantly reinventing business models in order to sort of just stay in business, in order to like build viable businesses. And so in the West, a company like Big Cabal Media would be driven by advertising and sponsorships, perhaps events, and that would be it. Um, we have tried everything from the creative studio. We have advertising, and it's probably a third of our revenue. We have events, probably another third of our revenue, but we've created our consulting units because we cannot rely only on advertising and events for revenue. And so our consulting business buffers Zikogo's ability to create content, buffers TechCabal's ability to create content. We've tried a creative studio at times, creating video content for other people. As we forayed into film now, we are exploring a range of different models to fund that. Um, and so you have to be a lot more experimental on this continent in terms of what it is that drives your model, your revenue, than you would be in other markets. I remember when I joined this business, one of the things that I said was, and that has held true, and I was wrong about many, many, many things, but one of the things that I did come into this business with that has held true is that resilience of revenue will be the most important thing for any media business on the continent. You cannot have a single revenue line. You cannot even have two revenue lines because in different years, each of those revenue lines will shake in ways that threaten your viability. And so you have to have multiple lines of revenue. You have to constantly be experimenting with new ones in order to maintain stability. And that's just essentially to maintain a level playing field because year on year, the economy will do crazy things. Nigeria's faced devaluations. In 2020, we faced COVID and advertising almost disappeared. Our events business some days looks, I mean, we have an event like Moonshot, which is 4,000 people and growing tremendously right now. But there were years where our event business was not a contributor to the business. And so you're constantly experimenting with these things and trying to find new peaks and letting one section of the business support other sectors of the business. Um, and I think that building businesses with that kind of resiliency of revenue is really essential if we are going to grow as media businesses across the continent to the scale that we need.
Thank you, Tomiwa. So just if I'm getting what you're saying clearly, one, you talked about the fact that film and music have essentially created power, giving Africa sort of a chunk of the global creative economy that it didn't have before. And and in doing that, there's also, and sort of the response to that was this influx of foreign companies coming into to scramble, almost like another scramble for Africa. Where I sit as a lawyer, I can say that I have seen this happen firsthand. For example, again, one of my big, I guess, breakout jobs as an entertainment lawyer was bringing Universal Music back into Nigeria and sort of being their counsel up until when they then subsequently acquired Maven, right? And you see that acquisition of the largest indigenous record label being a signal of really what is happening, where these major labels are acquiring, just like you said, all these, rights. And then there's now the issue of, well, if there's no local ownership, is this sustainable? And I talked about Combini and how Zikoko has replaced Combini. And I remember again being involved in that process. Combini leaving the market because of the market volatility, and whilst already building this audience that had nowhere to go, right? And then again, Zikoko came in, and several other platforms like Pulse, which a lot of people don't know. Pulse also is not a locally owned media company as well, coming in and taking all those spots. So it's very interesting to see those linkages, and then talking about sort of the abnormality of how the industry works, where, for example, a media company, and generally creative economy is driven by advertising. At the end of the day, content, who wants to see content? Everybody wants to see content, and advertisers want people who see their content, but there are certain structural issues that don't allow for that, the normal flow of revenue to work. I'm pointing this out because we're going to come back to this at some point, Tomiwa. I'm going to ask you some questions and have a discuss with you around that, because I think it's very important for investors to understand some of these issues. So I'll quickly move on to Jesaya. And so from an investor's point of view, do you see a growing appetite for backing creative economy ventures? I mean, Tomiwa just talked about the fact that obviously, really creative economy is sexy right now. Everywhere I go to, and I tell people, I remember when I first started, I said I was an entertainment lawyer. People said, "You a what?" It didn't make sense. And now, my dad's friends call, "Oh, my son." Even in Nigeria, we now have a ministry for the creative economy. But from the investor's point of view, is this appeal also extending to investors? And what signals make a cultural or a creative venture investment ready from your perspective as a seed level funder?
Thank you very much, Isioma. Hopefully, I'm a bit more audible now.
Yes,
Yeah.
you're a lot
Okay.
clearer. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, from really my standpoint as an investor, I think there is a clear growing appetite for investing within the creative economy. I think if I can speak perhaps from the perspective of what's going on in Southern Africa, as well as in my home country, Namibia, I think there's been a lot of intentionality from government to invest into, basically early stage entrepreneurs within the creative industry, and where there's basically also a push from entrepreneurs within the creative economy also not to just be seen that what they're doing as passion projects and such, but really to be seen as actual entrepreneurs that can add value to the economy, and also perhaps have external investment come into the economy as well, or them basically leading foreign direct investment. Obviously, we also have been seeing platforms, that have, increased basically revenue streams for entrepreneurs in the creative industry that can be digital, such as streaming platforms for film, as well as e-commerce platforms where you can now sell your fashion, as well as so it goes, as well as obviously again music now, with the various digital platforms that have risen. They also seen budding sectors such as gaming, and so it goes. So there is quite a lot of interest from an investment point of view in all of this, given that there's a huge global market out there for African content. I think if I have to now talk about what exactly do investors look at, right? So investors look at different things, when it comes to an investment. And I think many times you look back at the basics. Yes, it might be within the creative industry, but let's look at basics, right? Does this particular entrepreneur have a clear business model? Because sometimes, there is no clear business model, although there's a great perhaps product per se, but basically what is your route to market, right? Perhaps when you look at things like you have a good governance structure in place, with just one person that's kind of pushing this, but doesn't keep financial records, it's not registered for business, there's no compliance with regulations, things of nature, right? Is there market traction, right? Those are things you look at. Okay, what have you done, right? I know I'm an early stage investor, but what have you done to show that there's potential here, right? Don't necessarily need to have generated necessarily revenue, but have you perhaps done, let's say you're a musician and stuff, and you've done kind of shows, even free shows, where you've attracted an audience, if you're a fashion designer, have you kind of at least sold a few pieces of shown some kind of traction to for me to believe that if I were to invest into a business, there is obviously there is some kind of business promise here, and also I think for me at least, every time I invest into a business, I almost try to back a founder, right? What is the passion behind that founder? What is the vision they have for their business? That all of those things are very important. Obviously setting aside the fact that it's in the creative industry, I think the business principles are still very, very important, because at the end of the day, as an investor, you're looking to say, look, if I were to invest my money into this particular business, will I get a monetary return? And I need to be confident enough to say that answer will be yes before I'm able to risk my funds into your business. Obviously, it doesn't work out. That's so be it. Like lots of early stage startups, unfortunately, do not work out. But there's always that promise that some of the few you invest into will kind of blow up and really give that return. That will kind of in a day out kind of what's the word outshine the funds that you've lost, and you're actually able to make a profit at the end of the day. So those are some of the things I in particular look at when it comes to investing into any early stage entrepreneur.
Thank you so much, Jesaya. I wanted to just give some stats at this stage, just because now we're talking to the investors. So UNCTAD, which is the UN sort of agency that deals with the creative economy, and they usually do studies. So the last UNCTAD Creative Economy Outlook 2024 estimated that the creative economy contributed about 4.3 trillion to the global economy, $4.3 trillion, which is about 3.1% of global GDP, and created about 50 million jobs. And Africa's share of that is only about 1%, but there's a projection for 2030 that Africa should capture at least 10% of global creative goods exports, which is valued in about billions. Right now, the sector is valued for Africa at $4.2 billion. So this is a space that has a lot of potential, is clearly not reaching that potential. And one of the major challenges for that is underinvestment. But my view from where I sit, and aligns completely with what you said, Jesaya, is that at the end of the day, money follows returns, right? Nobody wants to invest in anything that is not going to make returns back. And there are just certain standards and metrics for those things that frankly don't change sector to sector. Yes, each sector and the creative economy is made up of different sectors, from film all the way to animation, fashion, and within fashion, you have garment manufacturing, textile production. Within creative economy, you have leisure, which is hotels, casinos, and the rest. It's huge. It's 49 sectors, right? If you follow the UNCTAD classification. But at the end of the day, it's a business, and people want to make an investment in places where they're going to make returns. And in my experience as a lawyer, what I find a lot with creative businesses is that they are not ready for the investment, right? They don't have the financial tools. They don't have, and they're struggling to just keep the business alive. Like you heard what Tomiwa talked about, having multiple streams of income, constantly experimenting, which is great because it makes them resilient, but that can be very challenging to process from a financier's point of view, which is why, in my view, equity investment and seed investment is critical. And when you look at the most successful investments, like the one you have with Maven, which in my view is the most successful creative economy investment right now on the continent, Etomo sort of touched on that a little bit when he was speaking. You would see that when they got their first equity investment into the company, they had to go through hand-holding and restructuring to then reposition for this larger acquisition that happened going forward. So thank you so much, Jesaya, for your interventions. So I'll move on to you, Jean-Luc. Now, people always make the mistake that sports is not part of the creative economy. It's actually like a mistake that a lot of people make. Um, and here at A-Band, we knew that that didn't make sense. You can't talk about the creative economy without talking about sports. At the end of the day, something as simple as like a live event, like a show, can happen at a stadium, which is just a very simple way to show how these two sectors are fluid. So how does investment in sports contribute to the broader cultural and creative economy? And what opportunities exist in bridging grassroots sports development and private sector-led sports business? And how can we, in doing all these things, be pushing the wider creative economy, but sort of using a sports-led model, or whether we can learn things from sort of like sports investment. So Jean-Luc, I'll leave you to sort of process that and answer that question. I know it's a loaded question, but I trust that you'll be able to give us a response. Thank you.
No, but thank you. Yeah, but just before to respond to the question, I just wanted to jump on something that you said,
Yeah.
that many business are not ready for investment. And many of us who are doing, who are using our time to help people through basketball or want to invest our time in music, everything starts first with a passion. And when you start something, maybe to share your own, journey, or when you want just to help other people, you don't think about a business. It's just a passion. And I started Milidu 12 years ago with this, the mindset of I want just to give back. I had an education in France through basketball. I just want to give back. And it was not at first an idea of business. It's really then when I joined the NBA through the BL that I realized that this thing is a real business. And two examples came back to my mind. The first is when we launched the BL in Kigali. For me, it was first sports, but then you realize that with the arena, with the artist, this is a show. And I can understand why people don't bring that together. And we started with sport business, but now we're talking more about sportainment. And the great example for me is the AFCON in Ivory Coast. The singer Batamsir, his song was not the anthem of the competition. He came, people but discover, and now he's a megastar. So, but to have this kind of platform, the government invested $1 billion in roads, in facilities, in airports, and they came the help. But now people need to understand that the government cannot do everything. At some point, we need this private sector to come and to bring the people back together. So for me, when I just see my journey, merely to help me to help kids in communities, create a space for them. And I can tell very briefly a story of a young man named Samson. I helped him 8 years ago to go from Togo to Seed Academy in Senegal. It's an excellent, it's an excellent basketball academy in Africa. From there, he was selected for Basketball Without Borders in Johannesburg, organized by the NBA and FIBA. He received a scholarship from there to go to the US at the Patrick School in high school. And from the Patrick School, he joined UConn. I went to the US 2 years ago to attend a game at the Square Garden with more than 18,000 people in the arena. And he scored that day 16 points. Samson now has been selected by the Pacers G League team. But when I remember in that room at the garden that day, nobody realized that in Samson country, there is no single gym. There is no practice facility. How many Samson can we develop if we invest? And based on my experience now, through my nonprofit, I renovate, I build facility in villages and small towns. I saw the government doing those big arenas, but something is in the middle that you need to develop talent. is those facilities, those practice by facility. So someone needs to do it. If we do the right investment, then we can develop this whole industry. But for me, just to respond to your question, sports and entertainment goes together. And the perfect example is the NBA revenue. 50% is coming from the media rights and 20% is coming from the experience at the arena. But in people's mind, the thing that the sport money is coming from sponsorship, it's not true. So we need to go back together. And I think Afreximbank and other top institutions have that in mind now, that the creative industry combines sports, music, media, and all those environment that we're talking about. Isioma, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you so much. And I thought that was a really great, you kind of answered the question really by sort of showing the linkages between how the businesses start, and sort of getting to the point where you realize, well, this is actually a business venture. But again, your story sort of fits into what I'm saying about why angel investment is so well suited for this sector, because you're able to provide guidance, right? In a way, in a very up close and personal way that I think a lot of creatives need, because like what you said, creatives start these ventures based on passion and love for whatever it is that they are doing at that time. And sometimes by the time they realize that this is a business venture and they need capital to scale, they are getting to that realization almost too late in terms of having certain things that the traditional investor would want. And which is why we're doing these sessions, and ABAN has decided to create this platform to be able to essentially like prepare investors for the reality of investing in creative economy ventures here. So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to say anything else, Jean-Luc, in terms of the question, or do we move on to another set of questions?
I think we can move.
All right, thank you. So I'll come back to you, Tomiwa. TechCabal has shaped narratives around African startups. Um, I know that has been a difficult job sometimes when we hear about the combustion of one tech startup and the other. But how does storytelling and media influence investor confidence in creative ventures based on your experience? Because, I mean, in tech, despite all the explosions, they are still investing in tech startups in Africa. So what can we learn from the storytelling that is done in tech for the wider creative economy?
Well, I think it's important. Look, storytelling people people know first of all that there actually is a tech ecosystem to invest in, and that might seem self-evident, but I'm not sure that investors in Silicon Valley or in Europe or Asia are always confident that there are tech companies in Africa to invest in, that there is a reason to look to Africa beyond sort of traditional resource removal from the continent. And so the existence of a publication like ours just allows them to, see the breadth of this ecosystem. There's things happening in Kenya, there's things happening in Egypt, there's things happening in North, South, East, Francophone Africa. And so that's the first job that we play, is actually just letting people know what is happening in these ecosystems, that they exist, what are the hot sectors, who's doing interesting work. Something like the TechCabal Daily, which is our daily newsletter, is just important as a touch point. You don't have to open it every day, but it does let you know sort of what's happening from a regulatory perspective, what startups are doing, interesting things. I cannot tell you how important that function is, both for people within and outside of the ecosystem. It's just kind of a sense that this is an active and growing ecosystem. There are people doing important and meaningful work, and you can keep track of it. So that's, I think, just the very first role. I think even when companies are blowing up, it is critical to have an accountability function. And I think that for investors, it is useful to know that within the ecosystem, we are not tolerating all kinds, especially on a continent which can I mean, even amongst ourselves, we're very low trust. And in terms of our global perception, there is definitely difficulty with with this perception of doing business in Africa or with bribery, etc. And so seeing that, when companies are misbehaving, there's a local ecosystem, there's a local media that kind of holds them accountable, actually can be confidence inducing. It is, yeah, these things happen, but here's a full analysis of what went wrong, who were the bad players, what were the mistakes. And sometimes this is interesting for us. Sometimes companies blow up and it's not for malfeasance. It is inexperienced founders. It is tough markets. These are not the easiest markets. And so just allowing a full picture of what is happening is really, really important. And so I think that we serve that function. And then besides the coverage that we do, whether in writing or video, I think that events are a form of storytelling. We certainly, as a business, think of them as a form of storytelling. And so the fact that we have a conference called Moonshot, just the way it's titled, is an indication of is storytelling. It says that as a continent, we are doing important and ambitious work. It says that as a continent, the most important bets are still ahead of us. And so, in creating that, in terms of what content tracks we choose to showcase within that conference, in terms of what kind of speakers, in terms of what kind of themes. So, the theme for this year's conference is building momentum. And so, we are speaking to the fact that actually, after the highs of 2021 and 2022, inflated valuations, lots of money flooding in, zero interest rates globally, and then the big crash, 22, 23. Actually, we're building momentum again. We have founders now who have gone through multiple cycles. They've gone up, they've gone down. We have founders who have worked through two or three sort of high growth startups. They were at, you know, they've gone through Cellulant, they've gone through Flutterwave, they've gone through Paystack, they've gone through all of those. They've gone through Jumia and then gone through MoneyPoint. And so they have a real operational capacity, a real understanding of what it takes to build a startup from start, to exit or to at least significant size. They have a real understanding of what the market needs. And so we have a lot more of those, and the companies they're building are a lot more viable. So we're at a different inflection point, we're at a momentum point. All of that is storytelling, and all of that is why, I mean, you talked about early stage investing being really, really important. This is definitely part of our thesis. I think that you're seeing mature startups within the ecosystem raise 30, 50, $100 million, combination of equity and debt. But if you ask from my perspective, we need to see a lot more angel investment now because you need your next crop of startups. And I think AESIS serves this function, ABAN serves this function. You need early stage investment into what are going to be your next set of superstars. And so when Paystack happened, everybody was like, oh my God, I missed that wave. When Flutterwave, I missed that wave. Well, if you don't invest early, you're going to miss the next wave because they don't announce
Yeah.
it. I mean, the
Yeah.
announcement you see is the exit. So you got to be investing early. And so, I'm excited. Avon's doing the annual conference in Lagos, Nigeria, the same week as Moonshot. I'm excited for investors to come and to see what early stage startups are doing and to write checks. And it might be a 5K check, it might be a 10K check, it might be a 25K check. I've collected checks in all those sizes. And it can deliver incredible returns if you're early enough and you find people that are doing interesting work. And I think that we definitely need, a strong boom in early stage investing and angel checks across sectors. And again, from a storytelling perspective, like I said, the creative economy every year is one of the most important sort of like sectors within Moonshot's agenda. We do future of commerce, we do emerging tech and crypto, we do like all the big hot stuff, climate tech, etc. But usually one of the really well attended ones is the creative economy one. And we have practitioners coming and talking about their work, but also investors coming and talking about, well, how do we finance infrastructure for this
Yeah.
space? How do we
Thank you
build?
so much, Tomiwa.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll move back to you, Jesaya. Are there opportunities for blended finance or syndication in creative industries, in your view? Just jumping off of what Tomiwa was saying just now around coming in early and early angel investments is being critical for this space?
Yeah, I definitely believe there is. I think, again, I think the reason why perhaps to date there has been a lack of investment within the creative space is because perhaps the way the industry is, number one, perhaps portrayed by traditional investors, or rather, maybe the better word is understood by traditional investor, and also perhaps at times how many of the entrepreneurs within creative space perhaps have organized themselves. Okay. Now, if perhaps traditional investors, start looking, really studying the creative economy, as you mentioned, there actually is a lot of value within it, and it's great value for return on capital in the long run, right? So perhaps now to bridge that gap between where traditional investors are right now and to where the real value is to unlock this. That's where blended finance perhaps comes into play, where government can really say, look, we see the value in the creative economy. We're going to invest into it, right? So currently we on the continent, obviously we have as was mentioned now, the Africa Export Import Bank with their fund to support creative economy, the creative economy, and I believe that's for about $500 million US. That's quite significant. But the question is, at least perhaps me sitting in a small country like Namibia, is how easy is it actually for creative entrepreneurs to access it, because it's very important that that blended financing vehicle is used to access greater capital that's available both within Africa as well as Africa, given that we know this is a huge creative economy has a huge potential. We've also seen, obviously, the HEBA Fund out of Kenya. Perhaps to speak just to shortly again on Namibia, what's been going on here with the new government. They've really have placed a huge emphasis on the creative economy, where they want to invest quite a lot of money into it. There's been funds made available, particularly for youth entrepreneurship, but it's about $25 million US annually. They want to pump in the economy, but these creative entrepreneurs are encouraged to apply for that facility. And one of the initiatives I'm working on right now is with our National Arts Council of Namibia, with another entity I'm involved in. It's called Basecamp Business Incubator, where the idea is we are training creatives on entrepreneurship skills, given that they already understanding that they have a creative skill already, and pairing that and then give them a small amount of grant funding to hopefully then help them start generating revenue, which then will later on lead into them applying for commercial funding, might it be debt or equity. So that's just as my view on this. So definitely lots of opportunities, from blended finance. I think there just needs to be intentionality from both the financiers as well as the creatives to really structure themselves in a way that they are deemed investable from those with capital.
So if I were to just stay with you, Jesaya, would you say that angel networks in a way can de-risk creative sector investments potentially?
Definitely so, 100%. But again, I know I'm laboring on the point, but it's really to say, okay, for an investor, especially in Africa, and I've worked on building our angel investment here in Namibia, network here in Namibia, and there's a huge, unfortunate risk aversion from investors. Doesn't matter if individuals or corporates or institutional. Okay, so to de-risk, I think to help our current investors on the ground in Africa to really put money into the creative economy. I think there's a need to really educate them, and sessions like this are important in terms of how can one invest into the creative economy and still make a profit out of it, and obviously meaning making a positive return. So, and that is where perhaps the misalignment is. But again, there is a huge value in it. But I think that is what's definitely needed. Rooms like this to be made available to investors so they can understand the value of the creative economy.
Thank you so much, Jesaya. So I'm back with you, Jean-Luc. So sports is often tied to national and cultural identity. I mean, Nigeria, Cameroon, sports is a religion, frankly. Um, and how does this help attract both local and international investments? And sort of again, just how do we ride this wave, right? In supporting more investment into the sector.
No, I think it's a good point. It's I talked about previously about the FCON. It was a great success in Ivory Coast, but what we realized it's the government put 1 billion, but at the end of the competition, the question was the legacy. We had only one local player who were part of that team. And we saw the benefits of the investment, but how that contributes to develop the local economy. And it was at that moment that we were asking ourselves the ultimate goal of Omega Sports. Because if you just want to make money in football, for example, it's easy. You have your academy and you transfer the players. And when you send 2, 3, 4 players to Europe, you know that you're gonna make a lot of money. But the reality is that right now, sports GDP in Africa is only 0.5%, when in the world is between 2 to 3%. So our challenge now is not just to convince investment, because we know that people want to invest. We know that people want the return on investment, and we know that there are things that you can do in sports to make money. But what we're trying to do through Omega, it's also how can we develop the local industry. So, I mean, this is where it's sometimes a little bit tricky, to convince by people, but this is also why we need angel investor, people who can understand that it's a long-term investment. If it's just about making money 2 to 3 years, we can do it. But what we're targeting now is how can we transform our continent? It's not just about having an impact. It's really more about how can we transform this economy. And sometimes, but people need to understand that it's a long-term plan. So yeah, I think on our side, but this is what we're trying to make the difference, and trying also to convince angel investor to come with us. And through Omega, we had that first phase where we raised $1 million through friends and family. We're planning to launch a Series A of 15 million a year or two from now, but we are in the middle of something where we want to raise 5 million, because we know that we need to professionalize this sector. We need to convince the people. We need to take all of those club presidents, all of the people who are launching the project, to explain that if you want to grow, if you want to scale, you need to formalize. And as we start the discussion on saying that it's something we start with patience, this is where we now we know that we have something special. We know that the sports and creative industry, it's something that can really, really change the face of the continent. We saw how Sebastian Haller, just on scoring a goal, changed everything in the country. So now it's more about, this thing in the middle, how we can bring people with us, convince them, and also, attract those angel investors, that it's not just about help. It's a real investment, but that will take time, to reach the goal.
Thank you so much, and I just strong points that you landed there. Need for long-term investment for sector transformation, I think, is a major takeaway that everybody should take away from here. But I'll stay with you, Jean-Luc, and ask, how do you see, because I saw you talking about everything can't be government, which I 100% agree with. But then I'm also linking it back to some of the things Jesaya was talking about that the Namibian government is doing. And in fact, I've also been involved in a lot of things going on in Nigeria, such as advising our Ministry of the Creative Economy. I just recently finished a study where we did the data mapping of the creative economy in Nigeria. We've never done that as extensively. And this research is a backdrop for the implementation of something they call CEDF and CITCO, which is the Creative Economy Development Fund and the Creative Industry Creative and Tourism Infrastructure Corporation. These are two vehicles, PPP vehicles that the government wants to use to essentially co-invest with private sector to unlock the potential of the creative economy and tourism within Nigeria. Just before I stick with you, Jean-Luc, please, I know we're behind. June, I hope we're going to get maybe an extra 10 minutes because of the little hiccup earlier.
Yeah.
And please, if you have any questions, kindly drop your questions in the chat box. I am actually checking intermittently so we can take those questions. We will be going into Q&A in the next 5 minutes. So Jean-Luc, how do you see collaborations between investors, sports organizations, and governments to unlock this long-term value that you speak about within the space?
No, I think it's a very good question, and it's something that is taking time. And I'm glad. Sometime, I was born in a family where my father was a politician, and it's something that everybody needs to be at his place and bring something different. And I'm Togolese, but I'm living in Senegal and I'm working in Ivory Coast. And in Ivory Coast, as I mentioned at the beginning, if someone wants to build that huge arena, $100 million facility, it's not necessarily something for the private sector. The private sector can contribute, but it's more something not to be supported by the government. But it's our role as a private sector to explain to the government the outcome. Sometimes they won't see it. Yesterday, I saw a number that in France, sports can contribute to save 200 billion every year if they do the right investment. So they don't necessarily realize that sport is a powerful tool in terms of prevention for education, security, healthcare. But who's going to do that research? Who can do that? So I think it's also the role of the private sector, not just in terms of investment, but we have to come to create a momentum, work maybe with the nonprofit, but we are at our place, but to create a momentum, do those research and prove with numbers to government, the outcome of an industry like the one that we're trying to develop. So I think it's a real collab. We have to advocate. We have to organize the conference. We need to, be part of those kind of discussion, but it's a long-term discussion. But really in my sector, I think that the decision maker never keep in mind this role of sport. For example, I had the chance to go to the Ivory Coast Juvenile Center like 10 years ago, and I met with kids who kill, who rape, and when I heard about the story, it was not like in movies. It was not a plan to kill someone. That just happened. And I left my country. I was but 13. I saw my dad go in jail. So I grew up with this thing in me, like, this world is sometimes unfair. And it's only at the juvenile center that I realized the role that sport played in my life. So we're trying to explain the economy, a lot of things about sport in creative industry, but I think we should also think about how this industry can help to build a better place for our countries and how this industry can bring that education, that wellness, that security. And you cannot always put numbers like, if you invest that, this is the return on investment you're going to have in terms of money. We also need to think about what we're saving, the place that we are building. Before I traveled to Nigeria, I only heard bad story about Lagos, but it was a great place. So I think we need to also see the power of this industry and not necessarily about the big money we're going to make. It's important, but it's a part of the private sector to explain all of those benefits of those industries.
Thank you so much, Jean-Luc. So Tomiwa, my last question to you And if you recall earlier, I said I was going to come back to this point about where do you see collaboration between tech investors and creative industries? What's the sweet spot? We seem to be swimming in the same waters on two different sides, with the tech industries being far ahead, where in creative industries, we're talking about underfunding being a major challenge, even though we've gone ahead and we've captured a share of the space in terms of visually, right? Like in terms of you can't talk about creative economy and creative industries without talking about Africa anymore. We're there, right? But somehow that's not tallying up with the investment coming into the space and subsequently the scalability and growth of that space. So where do you see the collaboration between tech investors and creative industries that could really sort of bridge that gap?
I think a lot of work is at very early stages and is struggling, is structuring companies to receive capital. So I think there's a lot of development work to be done across industries. I think something like Hiva Fund in East Africa has the right idea, which is working with, sort of like early stage creative economy companies, both investing capital in them, but also helping them um, to structure themselves to actually participate in this economy. Because if you want to raise capital, you need a particular kind of company. We've talked quite a bit about that over the course of this call. I think that there is a little bit of caution I will advise in terms of that partnership. And I will say this, I think very few creative economy companies will create venture outcomes. And it is important to be clear about whether you are structured for venture outcomes, because it's easy to go and raise venture capital. Actually, no, first of all, it's not easy to go and raise venture capital. But if you do raise it, it's really, really important to be able to deliver those outcomes. And once you raise it, the expectations then go through the roof. And so the question is, what kind of capital do you need to raise? And I think that some of the work for the lawyers, for the investors and the early stage investors is to help their companies think through, look, what kind of capital will deliver the outcomes that you are looking for? There's a lot of infrastructure that we need across the continent to really sort of like unlock the value of the creative economy. Some of it is needs PE money. Some of it needs long-term infrastructure development money. And so it's critical in order for us to deliver the outcomes, like for us to like invest in all of those different stages. And so I think kind of like the kind of research that you said you just did into mapping the creative sector is really critical. And we do some of that work within TechCabal Insights as well. And I know Hiva does some of that work. We need lots of companies just thinking about, look, what does this economy need in order to really grow? And then we need people to sort of like actually invest in those spaces. And I think that perhaps some of what our tech investors might do is say, hey, listen, this isn't going to deliver 20, 25x returns, but it is more likely to dependably deliver a 2x, 3x return or a 5x return or consistent dividends that we can then reinvest in other things. And so, when you take your big win, yes, some of it will go into your risk pool and will go and fund, very, very high risk startups, but perhaps some of it will fund sort of whether it's recording studios or performance venues, which will deliver cash flow over time and will then allow for bigger outcomes. Because if we don't have in Nigeria, sort of like venues in the top 10 cities, then how is Burna Boy going to come home and perform? He can only perform in 2 or 3 venues in Lagos once a year. Actually, that's if there's 2 or 3 venues for him to perform in. And across Africa, how do you do a Pan-African tour if we don't have venues? So someone's going to invest in that kind of infrastructure. And I think that some of the returns that will fund that will be the returns that come from sort of high risk investment, sort of like, really returning capital and then people reinvesting that in the infrastructure for the continent to sort of drive the creative economy.
Thank you so much. So I just went on the chat and I'm not seeing any questions, but I would open the floor to those attending if they would like to ask any questions. Please indicate by raising your hand, and when you are called, you would be unmuted. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please raise your hands, and you would be unmuted and be able to ask your questions. Are there any questions from the audience members, please? Okay. It doesn't seem like there are any questions, which I now worry whether we've done a good job or a bad job on this panel. But I would like each of the panelists to please, we should have done this actually earlier, but what does capital and culture mean to you? How do you reflect it in your work? And just your last sort of key takeaway points from this conversation to sort of tie everything up in a bow. So I'll go back to you, Jesaya, because I know that you have somewhere to be.
Thank you. I think for me, look, culture is, I believe, the essence of Africa. I think if you ask anyone in the world, when they think about culture, what is the first continent they think about? It's probably Africa. So we have so much to give to the world. When we talk about, I guess music, probably think about Africa or the African diaspora, particularly in the US, and say so it goes, and in many other aspects. So I think the question is now, how do we monetize it? That's where the capital comes in, right? And again, do we as Africans have basically the fortitude and the willingness and ability to perhaps invest into our own culture? Because we've seen our culture being successfully exported and monetized elsewhere, but not in Africa. So what's stopping us from putting the money into Africa to make sure that we actually benefit from our own creation? So I think it's high time we start doing that. So that, to me, that's really where I believe the intersection of culture and capital is. It is us really just being intentional about monetizing what we naturally create on the continent.
Thank you so much, Jean-Luc.
Oh, it's quite simple. I will say human capital. I think based on the story I share with you, you can realize, what is the importance in what I'm doing, and with Miledu, we saw this power of how grassroots initiative can help, and then with the BL, I learned about the business of sports, but where we're now, it's more like with Omega, we can understand the importance of the value chain and the different investment that we're doing, and especially now that we realize that if we want to make this sustainable, we need to cover all of those aspects. If you want to transform the human capital in something more cultural and with an economic capital too, we need to pay attention to that entertainment section. So I mean, yeah, it's more human capital moving to economic and cultural capital.
Thank you so much. And last but never least, Tomiwa.
As a Nigerian, we say, I will not carry last. Look, I think culture is a really powerful engine. Again, going to the conversation at the beginning of the call, it shapes the way the world sees us. And because it shapes the world sees us, and it shapes the way we see ourselves, which actually is probably the more important part, it shapes our futures. Because what you think you're capable of, what you think you're destined to do, the narratives that we believe really determine our future. And I think that culture really gives us the ability to shape those narratives. On a global basis, like I said, I think that, don't quote me on this, but we might be coming to the end of the American century. Its power and knowledge through its media of narratives. It's creating a whole new set of narratives that I don't think the world is as fond of. And I think that if we're going to have an African century where we do power the world, where we do come into our own and into our capacity, then I think that culture and packaging it effectively and selling it effectively and monetizing it effectively um, and shaping the world's perception, I think will be a very, very powerful part of that. And
Thank
yeah,
you
that's the
so
work that we
much.
do every day.
Thank you. I can see some questions have come in, but unfortunately, we're completely out of time to take those questions. And I hope that maybe if you think back on some of the things that were said, and I will just give a quick, some quick points that were made here, which is that, of course, Africa has stamped itself on the global creative economy landscape. However, there's a sustainability issue because largely most of the business is being operated by non-African actors. There's a growing appetite for investment with countries like Namibia and Nigeria, for example. I can see people from Senegal and the rest, but governments in Namibia and Nigeria were examples given in terms of them creating some support for entrepreneurship within the creative economies. Um, it was also important to point out that there is a need for all stakeholders, which include government, private sector, um, and investors to work hand in hand to unlock long-term investment for the sector, for sector transformation, and that angel investing is a critical part of that strategy. And platforms like ABAN are critical in providing investors the necessary education for them to know that this is a long-term investment that can be viable. We looked at some numbers in terms of the value of the creative economy and how much Africa is underrepresented in that, which shows you the space for growth. We talked about partnership with tech, and caution was advised in terms of knowing that the creative economy and creative ventures are not necessarily always suited for venture capital, but there's a need to be clear on what type of capital is needed depending on the type of venture. I'm just giving sort of the high level, I think, key points that were discussed. And another point which was made by Jean-Luc was about sort of governments knowing that it's not just about return on investment in terms of cash, but also in terms of social gains and social sort of the investments in these sectors being a way to address social ills, social inequality, employment issues, education, etc. So thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed moderating this panel of well-informed gentlemen. As the only lady here, I thoroughly enjoyed myself, and I hope that the rest of the audience enjoyed the conversation. Thank you again to ABAN for putting this, and we look forward to seeing you at AEGIS. Thank you so much, and I'll hand it back over to June.
Thank you, Isioma. Thank you, Jesaya, Jean-Luc, and Tomiwa for such an insightful panel. And yeah, this was very insightful. And just on top of my mind, we've had many investment conversations, and what is constant, regardless of the sector, is we need to have patient capital, and also we need to do capacity building for both investors and founders. And we have come to the end of the session, and we are past the time allocated for this session. And I would just want to mention that we still have the early bird ticket. I will share the link in the chat, and it ends this weekend. Until next time, when we convene back for virtual session 4. Bye.
Thanks for having us. Have a good night, everyone.
Night.
Thank you. Good night.